Only in modern geopolitics could a superpower look at a gigantic frozen island and say, yeah, let's buy that, as if it's a clearance item at the world's strangest yard sale. And trust me, this story only gets weirder. 1. Greenland sets the tone immediately by being the kind of place where a government official once had to explain with a straight face that roughly 80% of the country is covered in ice but is still geographically classified as Greenland, creating a naming contradiction so blatant it feels like an early prank from cartographers who never expected anyone to actually live there. The result is a landmass that looks like Antarctica, cosplaying as Ireland, which has led more than one confused newcomer to assume the name is a metaphor rather than a cruel frozen reality. And because the American government loves a rebranding challenge, some politicians allegedly saw this enormous icy contradiction and thought, in perfect capitalistic optimism, ah yes, the potential here is enormous. Slap a few shopping malls on the coast and suddenly it sells. It's the kind of logic that turns a glacial wasteland into prime real estate simply because someone thinks they can outmarket geology. 2. Greenland's population is so small, fewer people than a minor league baseball stadium, that any unexpected visitor becomes a topic of discussion faster than a celebrity sighting in a sleepy town. And one local official once commented that when new faces appear, everyone just quietly updates their internal census, because an actual census would take less time than checking the mail. This microscopic population has created a dynamic where an American proposal to purchase the island wasn't just geopolitical theater. It was essentially the world's most awkward, we'd like to adopt your entire community moment, with locals politely declining like people turning down a pyramid scheme at a family barbecue. And when someone pointed out that buying Greenland would increase America's landmass but barely its population, the reaction resembled investors discovering their big acquisition comes with exactly one coffee shop, 3 grocery stores, and enough people to fill a modest wedding venue. 3. Greenland technically belongs to Denmark, which means international negotiations about its future occasionally resemble a bizarre landlord-tenant relationship, where the landlord lives thousands of miles away and the tenant occupies a giant frozen apartment they didn't pick, but now can't imagine giving up. And this dynamic once produced a moment where Danish officials publicly clarified that Greenland was not for sale, as though someone had tried to buy the moon off a hardware store shelf. What's funnier is that the request wasn't rejected as insane, but rather as mildly inconvenient, like someone asking to borrow a lawnmower that hasn't worked since 1974. And because Greenland's self-rule government also has strong opinions about being treated like a collectible, the whole situation played out like a custody dispute, where both sides suddenly remembered the child has its own opinions and also happens to be the size of Western Europe. 4. Greenland's capital, Nuuk, is the kind of place where the phrase downtown nightlife means exactly one street of buildings that look like IKEA prototypes. Yet anyone visiting quickly learns that Nuuk also contains the world's most unintentionally intimidating view: mountains, cold ocean, and complete silence broken only by the sound of someone scraping ice off a window with the determination of a person who stopped believing in warm weather years ago. Government workers have joked that Nuuk isn't so much a city as it is a well-organized suggestion of a city, complete with a stoplight count low enough to memorize accidentally. And when U.S. officials floated the idea of ownership, some Greenlanders dryly noted that America might struggle to adapt to a capital where the biggest scandal of the decade was the supermarket ran out of fresh fruit again, which is essentially the opposite of every American political milestone in the last 50 years. 5. Greenland's fishing industry is the backbone of its economy, which means the nation operates under the unspoken rule that fish are to Greenland what influencers are to Los Angeles: everywhere, unavoidable, occasionally majestic, and responsible for nearly all the income. One economist quipped that if the fish ever unionized, Greenland would become the first nation overthrown by cod. The dominance of seafood has also created an environment where a person arriving with American ambitions about diversifying the economy is treated like someone suggesting you replace your entire electrical grid with interpretive dance. Possible in theory, terrifying in practice. And because surplus fishing rights were one of the things the U.S. supposedly admired about Greenland, the locals joked that America might not want to purchase the island so much as adopt its fish, which is the closest thing Greenland has to a celebrity class. 6. Greenland contains an abandoned Cold War base buried deep in the ice, which sounds thrilling until someone learns that the base was built with the sort of optimism only superpowers possess. where engineers plan to hide nuclear missiles under a glacier as if the ice were an obedient Labrador rather than a constantly shifting mass of nature committed to slowly eating infrastructure. The base was eventually deserted because the ice moved faster than expected, crushing tunnels and proving that glaciers have the same respect for military planning as toddlers have for expensive vases. Scientists later discovered the base still holds old waste and forgotten equipment, essentially a frozen time capsule of questionable decisions, and this was reportedly one of the reasons the US found Greenland interesting again, because nothing says strategic value like a Soviet-era snow cave full of decaying technology and unfulfilled ambition. 7. Greenland's weather patterns are so volatile that forecasters frequently have to describe storms as intense but vague, which is a polite way of saying the sky might dump snow, ice, wind, or something entirely new that meteorology hasn't named yet. One local described the seasons as winter, more winter, and the brief emotional hallucination before winter returns, creating the kind of climate that makes even seasoned Arctic researchers silently question their life choices. And because the US tends to assess foreign territory with an eye toward military logistics, some analysts admired Greenland's climate the same way a fitness coach admires a treadmill: dangerous, exhausting, and guaranteed to filter out anyone unwilling to suffer. It's exactly the sort of environment that makes a country seem strategically valuable and utterly unpleasant all at once, like the Arctic version of an exclusive gym that no one actually wants to join. 8. Greenland's airports are famously short, not out of some minimalist design philosophy, but because the island is shaped like a topographical dare, making runway construction an exercise in find a patch of flat ground before the mountain eats it. Pilots who land there often describe it as a test of nerves that separates professionals from people who panic when the beverage cart rattles. Tourism officials once admitted that expanding airports would help tremendously, but only if they could convince the landscape to stop resembling a half-crumpled soda can. And because American planners saw these airports and recognized both a problem and an opportunity, the logic went something like, sure, these runways are dangerously short, but imagine how many military planes we could squeeze onto them if we just ignore gravity for a while, which perfectly summarizes the US approach to challenges. See a hazard, declare it inspirational, continue onward. 9. Greenland has an official policy encouraging residents to keep sled dogs, but this isn't a whimsical cultural relic. It's the pragmatic acknowledgement that large chunks of the island require transportation options that aren't impressed by snowdrifts taller than office buildings, and sled dogs happen to excel in conditions where cars simply give up and begin contemplating retirement. One researcher commented that sled dogs are Greenland's version of rugged SUVs, except they require more fish and fewer oil changes. And when Americans observed this, some reportedly admired the practicality in the same way suburban parents admire pickup trucks they don't need but desperately want. Because nothing says frontier spirit like a mode of transportation that doubles as a weatherproof survival system and occasionally eats the equivalent of a family-sized seafood platter before breakfast. 10. Greenland's nightlife has a reputation for being both surprisingly lively and utterly unpredictable, largely because social gatherings often depend on whatever angle the sun decides to take that month. In winter, a celebration might begin at 3 p.m. in total darkness, creating a vibe somewhere between underground rave and seasonal depression support group, while summer parties occur under relentless daylight, producing the surreal effect of leaving a bar at midnight and needing sunglasses. Locals have joked that the island never truly sleeps, but occasionally collapses out of sheer confusion. And when American observers encountered this sun-powered chaos, some politicians apparently viewed it not as a cultural quirk, but as an advantage. Imagine, they thought, an acquired territory where citizens never miss work because time is an illusion and schedules mean nothing, which is the kind of optimism only someone with a windowless office could sincerely express. 11. Greenland's cuisine includes dishes that can intimidate even seasoned food adventurers, such as fermented meats buried underground until they reach a texture that can only be described as philosophically challenging, leading to reactions ranging from polite discomfort to the quiet existential reevaluation that typically follows a breakup. One chef explained that traditional Greenlandic food isn't about flavor trends, but survival in an environment where the produce aisle is the ocean and the winter menu is whatever won't kill you. And while American diplomats were introduced to some of these dishes during past visits, their expressions reportedly hovered somewhere between admiration and mild panic, creating the impression that the US might purchase Greenland but politely request someone else cook dinner, which is the global equivalent of buying a house while quietly hoping the previous owner leaves takeout menus behind. 12. Greenland hosts an annual sporting event where participants run across ice and snow with the enthusiasm of people who refuse to let weather dictate their hobbies, turning the landscape into a giant obstacle course that rivals anything television producers have dreamed up. Athletes describe the event as equal parts breathtaking and punishing, where the reward is bragging rights and the punishment is every muscle discovering its breaking point. Tourists watching from the sidelines often experience a delayed shiver of sympathy as they realize the race takes place in temperatures that would make a freezer complaint. And because Americans love athletic spectacles that border on chaos, this event reportedly fueled belief that Greenland had untapped potential as the ultimate adventure destination, because nothing sells a territory like the promise of watching other people sprint through sub-zero misery while pretending it's recreational. 13. Greenland's political debates occasionally revolve around mining rights, which has turned town meetings into surprisingly lively spectacles where environmentalists, investors, and people simply tired of hearing the word rare earth gather to argue about whether extracting minerals will save the economy or doom the planet. One official summed it up by noting that Greenland is basically sitting on a treasure chest guarded by a moral dilemma. These discussions grew so intense that when the US expressed interest in Greenland, some commentators speculated America was less interested in the land and more interested in the minerals quietly hiding beneath it, like a shopper eyeing a house they don't want just because the garage contains a vintage car. And while Greenlanders debated their future with the seriousness of people who actually live near the mines, international onlookers treated the whole issue like an expensive episode of political reality TV. 14. Greenlandic culture places enormous value on community because isolation is not a theoretical concept there. It's a daily reality enforced by geography, weather, and distance so vast it could make a postal worker cry. In many settlements, neighbors rely on each other for everything from transportation assistance to the sanity-saving ritual of casual conversation, creating a social fabric woven from practicality and resilience. Visitors often describe the sense of community as profoundly grounded, like a small town that accidentally became a country. And when Americans evaluated this aspect of Greenland, some analysts interpreted it through the lens of strategy rather than sociology, concluding that a territory with strong internal cohesion would transition smoothly into new diplomatic structures, which is the geopolitical version of assuming a house is valuable because the previous owners kept it tidy. Technically true, but missing the point by several frozen miles. 15. Greenland's glaciers move, melt, crack, and reshape themselves with the bored impatience of geological superstars tired of being photographed, creating conditions where scientists can wake up to find that yesterday's pristine field of ice has transformed into something resembling a frozen demolition site. One researcher joked that Greenland's ice is the only employee in history that works too much and too aggressively. The scale of this constant transformation is so vast that Americans analyzing the island for strategic potential reportedly viewed the glaciers as both a threat and a feature, with some imagining them as natural shields, and others quietly panicking about maintaining infrastructure on a surface that behaves like a slowly violent living creature. And because glacial behavior has no interest in human planning, any attempt to develop parts of Greenland inevitably feels like trying to build a shopping mall on the back of a migrating dinosaur. 16. Greenland's National Museum once had to explain to confused tourists that the famous mummified Inuit women on display were not props from a horror movie, but exceptionally well-preserved remains from centuries ago, preserved so perfectly by the climate that they look like. The cold air politely asked them not to decay. The museum staff reportedly fields questions like, "Are they wax?" or "Is this ethically allowed?" with the weary patience of people who know the real ethical crisis is the number of visitors trying to take selfies with ancient human remains. And because Greenland's climate does taxidermy-level preservation without even trying, some American strategists saw this and interpreted it in the most American way possible by quietly imagining the logistics of natural cold storage, as if the entire island were a giant freezer waiting for some future Arctic Costco to claim it, proving once again that if a landmass exists, Someone in Washington has already put a price tag on it. 17. Greenland's schoolchildren routinely learn to identify dangerous ice conditions the way other kids learn multiplication tables, because growing up in Greenland means instinctively understanding which frozen surfaces support human weight and which ones are auditioning to swallow you whole, a skill set that would turn most visiting Americans into immediate cautionary tales. One teacher explained that students pick up survival instincts early, not because anyone is trying to be dramatic, but because the environment doesn't offer the luxury of learning from mistakes. And when foreign officials observed this childhood mastery of Arctic danger, the reactions split perfectly between admiration and disbelief, with some analysts praising the resilience and others privately thinking, "So the kids grow up like tiny survival specialists, and we thought we could just buy this place like a beachfront timeshare?" Revealing the deep, hilarious mismatch between Greenland's upbringing and America's real estate daydreams. 18. Greenland's postal service occasionally delivers mail by helicopter to remote settlements because the terrain is so scattered that traditional mail routes would require supernatural stamina, or at least a team of marathon runners with wings, leading to scenes where a single envelope descends from the sky like a dramatic message from the heavens. Despite containing nothing more significant than a catalog and someone's overdue electricity bill, residents treat this as normal, while visitors stare wide-eyed, as if witnessing a government experiment in airborne bureaucracy. And when Americans learned that Greenland treats helicopters like glorified delivery vans, a few policy minds apparently detected great logistical potential, which is code for, finally, a place where we can justify using too many aircraft for extremely small tasks, proving that nothing excites the US. Quite like a location where sending air support to deliver birthday cards is considered a normal Tuesday. 19. Greenland has no roads connecting its major towns, forcing people to travel by boat, snowmobile, helicopter, or sheer emotional resolve, creating an infrastructure layout that looks less like a country and more like a choose-your-own-adventure book with a high risk of frostbite. One urban planner described the absence of intercity roads as deeply inconvenient and also completely rational, because forcing pavement across that terrain would be like trying to iron a crumpled ball of aluminum foil. Visitors often assume the lack of roads is an oversight, until someone gently explains that Greenland is not a place you tame with asphalt. And when American officials considered this, their reaction reportedly hovered between logistical dread and curious fascination, because a territory without highways is either a nightmare or a blank slate, depending on whether you're picturing mobility solutions or imagining writing the world's largest government invoice for snowproof construction. 20. Greenland's summers bring a sudden explosion of mosquitoes so relentless that locals joke the insects should be listed as a separate political party, one capable of influencing outdoor activities, dress codes, and the mental health of anyone unfamiliar with bug swarms dense enough to form their own weather system. Scientists have measured mosquito densities that would make tropical regions blush, with clouds of insects rising from wetlands in quantities that seem specifically designed to humble anyone who thought the Arctic would spare them from biological irritation. And because American observers examining Greenland's strategic value also encountered these mosquito armadas, some concluded that buying the territory would require developing diplomatic relations not only with Denmark, but also with the 6 billion tiny airborne negotiators determined to ruin summer, demonstrating that even the most powerful nations must eventually bow to the true rulers of warm weather. 21. Greenland's tourism board once faced the challenge of promoting an island where half the year is pitch black and the other half looks like someone forgot to turn off the sun, prompting marketers to embrace the absurdity by advertising the land of contrasts, which is a polite way of saying visitors must choose between existential darkness and vitamin D overdose. Travelers expecting a typical vacation sometimes discover that sightseeing requires scheduling around the precise mood of the sky, which may or may not support their ambitions. And when American officials evaluated Greenland as a potential acquisition, the idea of inheriting a tourism portfolio based on unpredictable celestial behavior reportedly caused both excitement and unease, because the US loves destinations with drama, but typically prefers it to involve fewer cosmic lighting challenges and more predictable opportunities for selling merchandise shaped like the landmass in question. 22. Greenland's healthcare system includes remote clinics staffed by professionals trained to handle everything from routine injuries to emergencies involving wildlife, storms, or disasters that urban hospitals rarely imagine. Because practicing medicine in Greenland means treating patients who arrive by boat, sled, helicopter, or occasionally sheer stubborn determination. One doctor joked that the intake form might as well include the question, "What mode of transportation tried to kill you this week?" Because the environment ensures medical stories always come with bonus plot twists. And when Americans studied this resilience, some imagined how the US might adapt to a healthcare landscape where ambulances sometimes have skis and emergency transport could be a fishing boat, revealing the gap between Greenland's rugged pragmatism and America's preference for roads, sirens, and medical dramas that don't involve examining frostbite at 40 below zero. 23. Greenland's local governments sometimes vote on community issues in meetings so small that the entire democratic process could theoretically occur around a single kitchen table, which produces decisions with the intimacy of a group chat and the seriousness of a nation-state, creating a political structure that is both charmingly human and hilariously incompatible with countries used to 500-page briefings. One resident noted that political disputes are resolved quickly because avoiding your opponent is impossible when they also stock the local grocery shelves. And when American officials glimpsed this ultra-personal version of democracy, reactions ranged from admiration to mild horror, as they imagined a world where voters personally know every elected representative and can bump into them while shopping for frozen fish, a concept that would instantly cause half of Congress to flee into the nearest forest. 24. Greenland's coastal villages often rely entirely on boats for survival, which has cultivated a population of mariners who can read water the way most people read traffic signs, navigating icy fjords with the casual confidence of people who learned from childhood that the ocean may kill them, but will at least be honest about it. Visitors watching these boats weave through floating ice often experience a mix of awe and heart palpitations, especially when a veteran navigator calmly steers around icebergs the size of office buildings while humming. And because America loves the idea of strategic maritime locations, some policymakers saw these fjords and imagined naval potential, apparently overlooking the small logistical issue that Greenlandic sailors can do in a dinghy what most U.S. fleets cannot accomplish without a meeting, 6 permits, and a prayer. 25. Greenland's scientific stations attract researchers who willingly endure 6 months of perpetual darkness to study climate patterns, creating a work environment that feels like a psychological experiment. No ethics board should approve, yet these researchers persist, gathering data in conditions that would send most office workers crying to HR. One scientist explained that the darkness becomes so absolute that people lose track of time and rely heavily on routine to avoid drifting into existential confusion, proving that humanity will endure almost anything for the sake of measuring things. And when the US contemplated owning Greenland, its science agencies reportedly perked up at the idea of managing even more Arctic research facilities, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of a child getting excited because someone offered them an extra chore chart filled entirely with frozen misery. 26. Greenland's social gatherings often revolve around community halls that double as event spaces, emergency shelters, cultural centers, and places where people collectively monitor the winter storms like they're watching a competitive sport, creating a social rhythm shaped entirely by weather patterns and the shared understanding that bad storms are not so much events as seasonal coworkers. Visitors expecting nightlife are sometimes startled to discover that the wildest evening activity might be a bingo game with extremely serious participants. And when American observers evaluated these communal hubs, they concluded that Greenland's social infrastructure is admirably efficient, perhaps even enviable, though they also quietly noted that any attempt to import American-style nightlife would collapse instantly under the weight of blizzards, logistics, and the Greenlandic preference for activities that do not involve pretending it isn't cold outside. 27. Greenland's icebergs occasionally drift south in shapes so dramatic they look like sculptures carved by a moody deity who never learned subtlety. And one such iceberg famously gained international attention after splitting in half in a way that resembled a perfectly sliced cake. Though anyone tempted to climb or photograph it from too close quickly learns that icebergs do not appreciate fans and will collapse unexpectedly like emotional teenagers. Marine authorities repeatedly warn people to keep their distance, yet someone always attempts to treat the iceberg like a photo prop, prompting lectures about gravity, mass, and the unforgiving nature of frozen architecture. And because America loves natural landmarks as long as they behave like well-trained pets, Officials evaluating Greenland probably discovered quickly that the island's icebergs are not the sort of national park feature you can put on a brochure without adding a lengthy disclaimer about catastrophic flipping events. 28. Greenland's dog sled races are community events that attract spectators prepared to watch competitors fly across the snow with the speed and enthusiasm of people who have made peace with the fact that their transportation method occasionally has opinions, because sled dogs are not engineered machines. They are furry coworkers who may decide halfway through a race that today is simply not the day. Race organizers take this in stride, offering commentary that blends sports enthusiasm with philosophical acceptance. And when American analysts studied these races, some noted the impressive athleticism, while others quietly wondered whether the U.S. could handle a sport where the athletes sometimes stop to sniff something interesting, which is a direct challenge to a country that expects its competitions to run on punctuality, sponsorship deals, and the collective illusion that everything is under control. 29. Greenland's geology contains rare minerals that make global corporations salivate, yet extracting them requires battling conditions that resemble the set of a disaster movie filmed inside a freezer, leading to mining proposals that oscillate between ambitious and delusional, depending on the season. Geologists have described Greenland as a treasure chest buried under an avalanche, which is a romantic way of saying that getting to the good stuff requires constant negotiation with a landscape that responds to human plans by shifting, sliding, or casually swallowing equipment. And when America briefly entertained the idea of purchasing Greenland, some strategists were less excited about sovereignty and more about the minerals hiding beneath layers of ice, demonstrating once again that the quickest way to spark U.S. interest in a hostile environment is to whisper the phrase "valuable resources" and hope nobody remembers that the terrain is actively trying to murder bulldozers. If all that didn't convince you the world's gone Arctic-level absurd, I don't know what will. Drop your pick for the dumbest one below, and if you survive this list, you know what to do.